The story begins in England with my grandfather, but doesn't stay there long. My dad was born in London in 1905. He had a sister, Reevie, 2 years younger. And some years ago, he died in 2002, he wrote out his story. His memory was pretty good, but then we all tend to think that of our own. And memories are surprisingly prone to error. Anyway, it's a pretty good story, so I've drawn in his words for the part that precedes my memory. In the spring of 1912, some school friends of my grandfather visited from Alberta. Their enthusiasm convinced him that they should emigrate. So on October 25th, 1912, the family boarded ship for a new life in Canada. My grandfather had a grocery store in England, a little village called Huntsville in Somerset. And he sold lamp chimneys in the store, amongst other things, of course. And this lamp chimney has his name and the name of the stores and so on it. Within a couple of years, the decision was made to homestead. Rather surprising, really, since neither of my grandparents were cut out for that life. The first few years in Alberta were very difficult. They took a wagon load of building materials and supplies to the homestead and got a shack built and tar papered just as the first snow of that winter started falling. One thing that helped them survive was moving into one of the nearby towns after the start of the First World War. Having been a grocer in England, my grandfather was offered the chance to look after a store not far from the homestead while the owner was overseas. After the war, they moved back to the homestead. The year before, they had a barn built and lumber and other materials gathered and stored there with which to build a proper house. Only a month or so after returning to the homestead, a bushfire came through and burned the barn and much of the stored supplies for the new house. I believe growing up on a homestead is what made Dad the resourceful, self-reliant person he was. It was on December 8th, 1924, that Dad went to work in a small sawmill operation. They had a CPR quarter and timber limit, and they spent the winter cutting logs on it. About the beginning of March, they got the sawmill ready and started sawing. It was on the 25th of March in 1925 that he lost his arm. It was a very bad time for his family and upset the sawmill owners a great deal too. After 9 weeks in the hospital, he came home and gradually learned to adjust. One challenge was learning to use his right hand. He had been completely left-handed, although he had been guided in school days to write with his right hand, as was standard practice then. Dad got out of the hospital in June. That summer, after receiving his first workers' compensation check, he bought a cabinet phonograph and 42 records. And those compensation checks weren't very big. Soon after that, he was sent to Calgary by the compensation board to be fitted with his first limb, which they paid for, as well as providing a train ticket. Soon after that, he was put on the permanent pension, which at that time was $17.99 per month. The late 20s were pretty good years, though there was never much money. The family slowly grew and became more productive. They even got indoor plumbing. They survived the Depression, growing a lot of their own food and trading with neighbors. In 1928, a bigger house was built. I think that's this one. In March of 1936, the minister who looked after the area, which included the farm, went on a holiday, and he asked Dorothy Benham to fill in for him. Since the farm was central to part of the area she covered, Miss Benham was invited to spend some of the time with the Squances. And so it was that Mom and Dad met. Within 2 months they were engaged, both being 30 years old. They moved a little faster than most. And they married August 5th that same year. Mom and Dad moved into the older house, and Valerie, Linda, and Beth were all born there. Over the next 9 years, the family grew. Oh, yeah, this was the honeymoon thing. I found that kind of interesting. It'd be hard pressed to go on a honeymoon at Lake Louise with a total budget of just over $70 nowadays. And the farm did just well enough to support us all. In 1943, my grandparents decided to move to Victoria. For my grandmother, it was heaven on earth, and the letters back to the farm extolled the virtues of living on the West Coast. Eventually, this decision was made to follow. The farm was sold, and my grandfather, who was in the real estate business then, made a deal with Clarence Oldfield for Norfolk Lodge, which came with about 100 acres. After a number of adventures, the family arrived and headed out to our new home. I'm getting a bit behind on the pictures here. These were still in Alberta. That was for the first move to Victoria, when all my grandparents' stuff was packed up and taken to the train, I guess. Dad sold the hay he brought from the farm to a store in town and got the Bray brothers, truckers, to move the stuff out to the lodge. They did it with 2 trucks and a trailer for the cow for $24. And so we started our life at Norfolk Lodge, September 1st, 1948. I don't know why there was no charge for the hydro then. This was winter 1944. But that was something my grandfather had. Money was always in short supply, even long after selling the farm and moving to Victoria. Somebody mentioned the Toby jug a couple months back. Somebody here worked there at the time, and my sister did too, but this predates that. I have no idea what the connection was. That's my grandfather's writing, and he had ledger. I've got ledgers all over the place. Most of them only a few pages in and the rest blank. But it seems like they sold flowers to them. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. In the early days, many of the things Dad made would not have been available even if there was money. But he had a lifelong habit of assessing with an accurate eye something he needed or wanted and would make a reasonable facsimile. When he built the house my wife and I now live in, and even before at the lodge where he built a garage, he made his own concrete blocks. He built the forms scrounged far and wide for months, if not years, for the 48-ounce juice tins. Remember those? To lighten the blocks and save cement, and made dozens of blocks, 16 at a time. For much of the garage project, the concrete was mixed by hand with a hoe on a sheet of plywood with 2x4 edges. For our current house, Dad had obtained a cement mixer. In my memory, one of Dad's most impressive constructions were the forms he made to pour the concrete to crib the hand-dug well, which supplied the water for our house for several years. Most people would have purchased the rings of precast concrete and dropped them in the hole. Those forms were such an engineer could be proud of. He also made the culvert at the bottom of Brookhaven Hill through which O'Donnell Creek flows. That too was quite an engineering feat. That's a recent picture. Life didn't immediately come easy for Mom and Dad. There was a growing family to feed and no steady job. For a few years, Dad sprayed orchards using a large tank with a high-pressure pump towed behind a tractor. I went with him on occasion to drive the tractor so that he and a fellow that sometimes worked for him could concentrate on the spraying. He even had jobs east of Henderson on Cedar Hill Crossroad. You wouldn't see vehicles like that crossing Shelburne nowadays. The tractor had a top speed of about 12 miles per hour. There were days he looked like a coal miner when he got home, if the spray had much color to it. Most of the time he didn't wear goggles and never anything like a gas mask. It's a wonder he lived to be 96. He got so he hated what he was doing to the birds and bees, he even used DDT for a while, and so sold the unit to Harold Thompson, one of his bigger customers. One time while I was at university, Mr. Thompson asked me to do some spraying for him. He'd also hired a fellow from the labor pool who knew very little about the job. The other fellow was supposed to drive while I sprayed. The first thing that fellow did was to back the tractor out of the shed and into a deck support post in one of the other buildings. Mr. Thompson was not pleased, and after that I did the driving. Dad did a variety of jobs, finishing up with the rural mail route in the early 60s. He started his contract at the beginning of December. I believe it was 1955. My sister Linda got a job helping the previous mailman, Mr. Gaskell, the summer before. It was very helpful for Dad to have someone who knew the route, at least to some extent, as the Christmas rush was starting to build by then, and sorting mail is a slow process at the beginning when you don't know the names or where they live. I'm sure a number of you were on our mail route at one time or another. The route changed quite a bit over the 6 years Dad had it. During the first half of Dad's tenure, the route was out of the Royal Oak Post Office. For a few years, the observatory was on the route. Dad would drive up as far as the office and take the mail in. Later, the post office made them pick up their own mail. That also happened with one of the other more interesting customers, a fellow who was a stamp dealer. I believe his name was Schultz, and he lived on Esteline Road, a strange little goat track from Prospect Lake Road up to a hilltop overlooking the lake. He'd often get a bunch of packages all together and would get a canvas bag to himself. The mail would come in canvas bags into the post office and then be dumped out and sorted. One time when the bag was emptied onto the floor at the post office, there were stamps strewn all over. One of the parcels had come apart. We used to occasionally have boxes of ashes for the Royal Oak burial part come through as well, though that wasn't on Dad's route. The boxes were lead-lined and pretty heavy. There are lots of stories of those days. Now all the rural delivery is to the group boxes, but most of you will remember having an individual box at the end of your driveway, unless you had house delivery. Many of the rural route people at that time would sit in the middle of the front seat and be able to drive and reach the boxes from the same place. Because of not having his left arm, Dad needed help. He drove, and Mom or one of us on Saturdays or holidays would put the mail in the boxes. Those boxes provided a few stories too. There was the occasional wasp nest or rotten post. I remember turning one that was very stiff, and when I pulled too hard on the next one, it was so loose that it spun around a few times and fell into the ditch. When they closed the Royal Oak Post Office, the route became Rural Route 7 Victoria. Briefly, it included the last bit of what is now the highway south of the Quadra Street overpass. There was a poultry farm there. Hats? Yeah. I believe the addresses were West Saanich Road. I don't remember any other names. Then it jumped to close to where Wilkinson crosses. Dad had a reputation for going above and beyond requirements. Later, when the post office was trying to limit service, he was expected to only deliver parcels the day after a notice went out, and then only once. If they didn't meet him, the parcel was supposed to be taken back and picked up at the post office by the recipient. Dad ignored that as much as he could and took parcels up to the door in many cases, with or without a notice. He realized it was difficult for many to get to town, especially the older folk. He was often recognized at Christmas with a few dollars or a pack or two of cigarettes, even a bottle of wine. Dad never smoked or drank his whole life, but it was all appreciated. This is something you just came across this morning, actually. Tuck that in there, too. Norfolk Lodge was purchased with about 100 acres and was selling parcels of land from the original holding. And finally, the lodge, there was enough money to build a present house, take a few trips, and help the now independent children over the occasional rough spot. Dad enjoyed building. He had help, but built 2 houses on the farm in Alberta and the one Mom and Dad lived in, where my wife Mary and I now live, until they went into care at the end of their lives. For the last one, he had very little help. He contracted the plumbing, wiring, stucco, and masonry, and had help with putting up the beams to support floor joists. I helped him here and there, but I had paying jobs in the summers he was building. The family were regular churchgoers when I was young. We attended Wilkinson Road United Church, and Dad was a mainstay for a number of years, being, among other things, the treasurer and superintendent of the Sunday school. Later, he became disillusioned with organized religion and dropped out. Traveling to and from church was often an adventure, as we had a number of quite unreliable cars in the years before the mail route. I remember being stuck in the snow on what we called Dickens Hill on Old West Road, just past Jackson's Corner. This was taken inside the church. See, I'm pretty sure that's Heather there. And Neil, her brother, there. There aren't an awful lot of them I recognize. My sisters and I had, I think, generally happy childhoods. We started school at the old Prospect Lake School, though Valerie had only grade 6 there, and Linda 1 or 2 more years. Except for Beth, we all started junior high at Mount Newton, since it was closer than Royal Oak. Later, for a while, that wasn't an option, though I don't know why, and the older girls went to Royal Oak. Valerie and Linda graduated from there, Valerie in 1955 and Linda in 1957. Beth moved back to Mount Newton for grades 11 and 12, and Faye and I were there too, until that again was not an option, and we had grades 10 to 12 at Royal Oak and Claremont. Valerie, Linda, and Faye all took up nursing, and Beth and I became teachers. Mostly, at least on my part, that was due to a singular lack of imagination. While we all lived for a time a long way away, 3 of us are back close to where we grew up. Valerie went as far as she could in Canada after her nursing degree was finished, since it was on the VON dime. She spent a couple of years in Digby, Nova Scotia. After returning, she moved to California and later to Washington State and is still there. A few years after graduating, Linda moved to the Shuswap area for a number of years, but finally gave up on her marriage and moved back here. Similarly, Beth taught for a few years and then got married and also moved to California. That, like Linda, was not her destiny, so she came home, later remarried, and she now lives next door. Faye also got married, moved to the U.S., and is now not far from Valerie in Washington. Mary and I went off to the Kootenays after I got my teaching certification and spent 7 years in Nelson and 28 in Fernie, where our 2 children grew up. They both went to UVic and never left the coast, so we moved back here too. With most of us contributing, my parents had 9 grandchildren, 5 girls and 4 boys. In general, my family has been quite blessed. Life wasn't always easy for some of us, but we've stayed in close touch throughout the years, have avoided any untimely departures. Mom and Dad both lived to be 96, and always had a roof and enough to eat. And Valerie just had a pacemaker put in a little while ago. Just after Christmas, so that's it. This is, these pictures are from that Yam magazine article. Some of you may have seen this published, it's the November-December issue. They were taken inside the lodge the new owners have been pouring a lot of money into the place. There's a lot of quite neat pictures there. This looks more or less the way it did when we were there, except of course it's a lot more polished and the furniture's a lot nicer. But a lot of the other parts of the building are completely different. There were, this was my grandparents' area, there were heat registers, it was hot water heating, they were under the window over there, and those are gone. Anyway, some details. Okay, so that's
Will you take questions, David?
Oh, sure.
Anybody got questions?
When was the lodge built?
The lodge?
Yeah.
That seems to be a little bit unclear, but I remember my dad talking to somebody who had worked for the V&S Railroad, and he said that they would have their meal break at the that sharp corner where the old Bear Hill Road crosses Brooklyn, just there where you could look across the valley and see, and they watched the house being built. So it was somewhere around the First World War, a little before, maybe between 1912 and 1915.
I think my Uncle Harold met your family through the church.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dad thought a lot of him. I remember borrowing his truck one time. I went along. Dad, I don't know what Dad was using it for. I don't remember, but I know we went to the farm, picked it up, did whatever. And, but we saw him at church. Yeah.
Was your mother an artist?
Well, I guess it depends on your definition. She certainly liked to do artistic stuff. I have an aunt who actually has a number of paintings. There were some in Government House for a while. And Mom has dabbled stuff. She did a lot of ceramics. And she did a little bit of sculpture, but not a great deal.
Didn't they build another house on Brookhaven?
Yeah, that's where I live now.
Where you live now?
Yeah, the lodge was sold, or at least the mail route days were finished before they sold the lodge. It's sold in 1966, and I don't know, what the very first listing, they listed it. Yeah, it was 45 acres for $49,000, or the other way around, I'm not sure. And this was listed at 33, I think. But they had cut it right down. They sold property between where the house is and Old West Road. And although there were already lots taken from Old West Road, but they had to put in Brook Hill, which is the little spur off Brookhaven, and that access property back there so they could reduce it. And then the big chunk right across from the end of Brooklyn, where our barn used to be, that there was another chunk taken out there. So it all reduced it down. I think they first listed it in 64, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe not, because Dad he wouldn't have been ready. The house wouldn't have, present one wouldn't have been built in time.
Was it hard to sell at that time?
Well, the realtors all thought he was nuts. He was asking way too much money, $49,000. But it was hard to get people interested. I mean, the thing is a bit of an awkward place unless you got a lot of money. I mean, we never had a lot of money, but when we purchased it in 1948 with 100 acres, it was $25,000. So
How long were you there, right?
we were there about 18 years, from 1948 until the summer of 66. We were, except for Oldfields, we were there longer than anybody else has ever been. Seems there's been quite a few. I was hoping to get maybe the tax records or some sort of sale records from Saanich or the government assessment office or something so as I could actually list all of the owners and the time periods, but I don't know if that's publicly available.
How many bedrooms and how many bathrooms?
There were 14 rooms. To call them bedrooms is a little misleading because there were at least one of them, I guess, I don't think, it was, I mean, it was almost as, it wasn't as big as this, I guess. It would be close to, from that opening across there, it'd be about the size of that. And I mean, I guess it counted as a bedroom. I mean, there was, somebody rented the space for a while. Dad put a little wee kitchen with a hot plate in one corner because there happened to be a sink in that area. Then there was, well, in the downstairs, there was what was originally the library, and where my grandparents lived was originally the sitting room, I guess, the parlor, and there was a huge dining room, which was one of those ones at the end there. But upstairs there was 5 bedrooms that were actual bedrooms. But and downstairs they were larger living spaces, and there was that one quite large one upstairs. There were 5 fireplaces altogether. There was one in the maid's parlor or whatever, just off the kitchen, and there was one you saw the one in the picture, the big entry hall, another one right behind that. Or at least what we use as a living room was actually the dining room, which is this one down here. This one. This was my grandparents' sitting. It was a bed sitting room. They changed the fireplace, the front here, but otherwise it's similar. But that big old fireplace in the entry hall over here is much the same. Up in the top there, that's a balcony along here. The bedrooms, my bedroom was in the corner back behind that, and then this was open and just ran down to the other side of the house.
Is the house still there?
Oh yes, yeah. This is what's been going on the last few months.
Wow.
They
Who was the architect for that house?
Samuel MacLeod.
Wow. Yeah.
There have been a few write-ups in the Islander magazine and before whatever preceded it, in the 60s or 70s, talking about the history of the house, and they mention a number of those things. Our family's never been mentioned, not in any of those. It was all generally they talked about the Oldfields, of course, and then whoever the current owner was at the time the article was done. But,
how many acres now?
well, that when Dad, I'm not sure if there was a little bit taken off. I think somebody took some off, so it's around 7 acres with it now, I think. I think. No, I really don't know any of the recent figures. I know there's, that's the one. There's, no, I really don't know any of the recent figures. I know there's, that's the one. There's, there's other pictures in here. This was the one that's there. But they just talk about the Grand Revival. I mean, they say things like it was completely run down, and it may be, and it was. I know some of the people thought that of the way it was when we left it. But some of these other pictures, like this one was my bedroom, but it didn't look anything like that. There was a fireplace in there too, but they didn't use it. This, I think, was a little too small, but right up here in the front, there's a balcony along there, and this was what they called the library, and my parents' bedroom was behind there, and so that this was open. It had a roof, but it was open.
When you were there, for the heating, was it still corded?
It was for when we started, but Dad put in a propane furnace. I don't know what year, I don't remember.
I can imagine the whole fireplace is probably.
Well, the fireplaces, as probably a lot of you know, fireplaces don't go an awful long way to heat. I mean, it's a little bit in front, but the furnace was quite efficient, as wood furnaces go. But it would take 8-foot logs. It was a huge wood furnace, and then there was the pipes right through.
Did you heat all the house?
Well, the bedrooms were pretty cold. There was what we use as a living room, which was, I think, officially the dining room, and that was this one. That, like I mentioned, there were hot water registers under this, and there was one big one in this hallway, in the front entry, and then up in this hallway upstairs there were 3, and then this room here was what my grandparents used as a kitchen, but it was originally a conservatory of some sort. And under these, well, they're benches now for sitting or putting up guests or something overnight. Anyway, there was a bench all under those windows, and there were 4-inch pipes that went around there for heating for plants. But when you think about the area that the furnace actually sent the water to, there was an awful lot of the house left to be cold. The bedrooms particularly, though, again, the master bedroom did have a fireplace, but it wasn't used. They just snuggle up, I guess. Well, we used hot water bottles and heated bricks and this and that. Yeah, the kitchen, of course, had a big wood stove in the early days. Later on, it had a gas range. But, I don't think Mom was any too anxious to hang on to the wood stove.
Did they build a house for the Oakfields?
I don't know who the contractors were, the builders. No, MacLeod just designed it. It went through a couple of phases. When it was first built, it wasn't all that impressive by modern standards. And then it went through, I'm not sure when. The first house may well have been built a few years before what I'm remembering is when I thought it was built. And then I know there was no stucco. The original house had wood shingle finish. And I think it was quite a bit smaller. I think they added chunks here and there. There were some interesting features. It had they had a water collection system from the gutters all the way around the outside off the roof, and then that fed a cistern which was down. There's a patio back in here, and underneath that patio there was a cistern which I don't know how deep it was, probably 6 or 8 feet, and maybe, no, I don't know, my memory's not that clear on it, but it was a pretty good size anyway. It held a lot of water. Anyway, it would fill up in the winter, and the soft water taps all were connected to that, so it used that water, the hot water taps, and then there was a well for the cold water taps for drinking and stuff. But
Did you have a well, or was it sewer, or what?
yeah, there was the well for the cold water, drinking water, and there was a septic tank somewhere. I'm not sure where that was actually.
Did your parents have any doubts about taking on something so huge when you didn't have much money?
Well, I was not even 3 years old when they made that decision, so I've really no idea. I guess they figured they could pool their resources and manage it because my grandparents moved in. Dad had a business. I don't know how much. He wasn't like getting rich or anything. He had a business in town, and they sold the business and they sold a house. He owned the Anchor Hill Apartments on Gorge Road for a while and rented units there. I don't remember if that was before the move or like quite a bit before, and there was another house in between. I really don't know. But then the farm, brought in enough. It was a struggle, but they managed. But they could never put the kind of money into it to really fix it up the way it needed to be fixed up.
Didn't Pat Poole buy the bottom?
Pat Hoole had bought you mean the Pat and Reg's dad?
Yeah.
Yeah, they bought the farm below the big house before they were there when we moved there. So they had bought that part from Brookley, or the line from Brookley. Actually, the house sits in the middle of the property line from Brookley. If you could come down Brookley, go and look straight up, the house is in the middle. The property line actually has to jog around the house, and then it went on back up to Old West Road. But so Pat had bought the property from there to Walton Place, and they owned all of that. I forget the acreage. And then later on, they bought the property that the Chinaman across the street, across Oldfield, the market gardeners. It was Chinese market gardeners had that. I think maybe there was another owner. I don't know.
Is that anywhere near where Sun Wind greenhouses are?
Yeah, they're a little bit further
Yeah.
north. When you go past Walton Place and start up the hill, Sun Wing is on the left, about 2/3 of the way up the hill. Well, Babe's Honey was on Walton Place, yes. Yeah, and so is Le Coteau Farm. The Dan Ponchet, who owns the market at the top of the hill, Dan's Market. So, anything else?
That was wonderful, David.